Okay, now that the modeling process is done, let's focus our attention on the rest of the model now in terms of the surface. You may notice that the color from video to video seems to change on my model. And the reason for this is up here we have this colors option. If I click on this colors option, you'll see a variety of colors being shown. The actual color representing the main body here of our prop is this one here. And the trigger here is represented on this color here. So if I click on this color and I change it, let's change it to something like this, you'll see it updates that color. And the same for the trigger. If I make it an orangey color, like so. So sometimes when we're changing the geometry around, these colors will randomly change around. It's pretty easy at the moment because we've only got a few objects, but when this becomes split into many different UV maps or different parts, then we will be adding to this color range. So it makes it a little bit more difficult then going in here and finding out which color represents which part. But for now, we'll just say okay. So now that I've created the model, I don't need this top piece called nozzle. That was one of the first pieces that we created. So I'm going to now delete this. So I will just enable it, click on that layer and hit this delete icon. You can see straight away it randomly chooses a new color for my model here. This color information, it's only a representation just to show the separation from either your objects or your UV maps that you create. Next, I'll take the bolt layer here. If I toggle the visibility on and off, you can see it's this small addition here. And I'll use the small dots that we can see at the end of this layer, and I will drag it, holding down Shift, and I will drop it on top of the main layer to add it to this main layer group here. So now I'm in a position where I can start to change the properties of this surface. And what I mean by that is to weight some of the edges of this surface and sharpen them, just to give me an extra layer of detail. Before we do that, let's have a look at what we have here as a visual representation of our model. Over here you can see we have this little drop down menu here, and if I click the drop down menu, you'll see we have a range of tick boxes. So let's go through these. First one being the Retopo wireframe. Basically it's what you can see here on the model itself, showing the wireframe. If I toggle this off, then you can see then we get this effect. Next is the UV seams. Now we don't have any UVs on this object as of yet. We will create some and we'll be able to see what these look like. The same for the sharp edges. We don't have any sharp edges generated yet, so even though it's ticked, we can't see anything. Next we've got the colored UV islands, and we've already discussed this. This is what's giving us the orange trigger, the main color for our main prop, and this bolt being different colored. So if I turn this off, you'll now see that we don't have those color representations anymore, and my model is just pure white. Let's turn those back on for now. And the final one down here is smooth view. Basically this just smooths out this faceted look that we have to our model at the moment. Let's just check that, and you can see now it gives it a kind of a plasticky molded look, which is fine for some surfaces, but the overall appearance is not something that we're looking for at this time. So this is where sharpening the edges we'll get the best of both worlds. We'll have those nice sharp edges on sharp parts of our model, but then the softer look that we have here can be represented where we don't have those sharp edges. So let's go ahead and do a quick demo of how to create these sharp edges. So what I'm going to do now is just zoom into this area here. So you can see I've got this soft view here still selected. I'm going to leave this one on, but I'm also going to turn on the Retopo wireframe as well, just so I can see the edges clearly. And I'm going to select this edge around here, and I'm going to select this loop around there. With that selected, I'm going to move down to where it says mark as sharp. And once I've selected that, you'll see something changed slightly. If I hit Control D to deselect the selection, which was yellow, you can see now that I have this blue line of selection around here. And this is what I was talking about here, where it says show sharp edges. Sharp edges are shown as blue. If I toggle this one off now, we can see that that is now removed. The sharp edges are still there, it's just we're not showing them because we've unchecked this option here. So here, for example, I'll just turn this one off, and I'll also turn off the retopo wireframe. So now we can see the difference that's made to our model, and it's given me a much better result on these two edges. Now when you go around your model selecting these edges, sometimes you may accidentally deselect an edge and have to redo those selections again. Here you notice that we have a load selection and store selection. So before I create my sharp edges here and I do this process of selecting these edges, let's take this loop here. When I save this edge here, I'll go over to Store Selection and hit Save. So just to recap, the blue line here shows a sharp edge and the yellow line here represents a selection. They're two separate things. Let's deselect our selection and go over to Load Selection, and I'll say Open. And you can see that it reselects those edges. Next, let's have a look at UVing. Now we can manage all our UV tasks inside the modeling room. There is a specific UV room here that we can use. However, whilst modeling, we can have access to all the UV tools and create our UVs directly inside the modeling room. So let's have a look at how we can do that. Now we can come down here, say Mark UV Seams, and with this Mark UVs selected, we can come down to here. So you can see here under the commands, we can do an auto map on here. And if we click this, you'll see 3DCoat goes ahead and auto unwraps this object for us. You can see here as I roll over these different colored islands, it's previewing how it's unwrapped. Now, the texel density of our model with this unwrap that it's created is fairly good. We've got an even texture distribution on all of those islands it's created. However, you can see in the UV preview here that it's rather messy. We can work on this. However, let's have a look at how we can manually create these UVs. So I've just undone that previous unwrap and I'm back to where I was before. So under the UV selection here, I have my Mark Seams selected. And if I roll over the object now, 3DCoat will try to preview how it wants to unwrap this object. And because it's got no seams, it's just creating this preview that we can see here. So what I'll do here is I'll go into this section at the top and I will select this loop here, and you can see with my Mark Seams selected, and whilst I roll over this selection, you can see that in the preview window that is the unwrap it will create should I go ahead and apply this unwrap to it. Let's do that again on a different section. Let's choose one of these edges here. So I have my Mark Seams selected. I've chosen this loop and I will left click, and now you can see it's unwrapped the central part of the end cap for me. You may notice here that we have this small red line here. And if I just turn off my colored islands, you may be able to see that red line a little more clearly. And that shows our UV seam that we've marked. Again, going back to this menu, now with this box here, I can show or hide the UV seams. So I'll tick that box again, and you'll see it comes up in this red color. So here, if I select edges again, you can see we've got our blue line representing sharp edges, our yellow line representing a selection, and our red line now showing where a UV seam is. As this is a modeling tutorial for beginners, I'm not going to go into any depth about how to UV the islands specifically. We will save that for a separate tutorial series. So to save time and to save you having to watch me select all these edges, I've loaded in a pre-made model here, and I can show you exactly which edges I selected to be sharp and which edges I used to UV this object. You can see in the UV preview down here that I've already UV'd this object, but let's have a look at the selections that I created. So first of all, let's select the Show UVs, and then you can see all the edges that I selected to mark my seams with. And now what I'll do is go back to my menu here. I'll turn off the UV seams. I'll turn on my Retopo wireframe again so we can see our wireframe. And I'll also now do Show Sharp Edges. And you can see all the selections that I made to make the edges sharp in specific areas of the model. So here, for example, I have this line of edges being marked as sharp, and this gives me quite a nice effect. So let's now turn on our smooth view and turn off our sharp edges so we can see a little more clearly. We'll also turn off our Retopo wireframe. Now you can see where we can add this extra level of detail on our model here just by telling 3DCoat which of these edges is sharp. I'll shift click into an empty space here with my brush selected, and I'll move and drag the light source around just so I can see how that light reacts to those new sharp edges that I've generated. So this is why this menu here is useful in order to assess how well it's looking under different lighting conditions, and also how this surface is going to be represented when it comes to texturing. You can also see here, if I choose colored UV islands, how those UV islands in our UV window down here are represented on our model. These are colored representations of the islands that we can see in our UV layout here. So with our edges marked as sharp and our UV seams generated, what I went and did was created my UV map by saying unwrap. I then arranged the islands so they were a little clearer to see, and then I hit apply UV set. Now again, this isn't a UV tutorial. We will be creating some for you which go into more depth about how to generate UVs. But for now, let's say for example that my UV is generated, and we can see here in this little drop down here that I have a Sci-Fi Prop UV created. So notice at this point that I have a polygroups called main, and I have my UV which is called Sci-Fi Prop UV. And now it's time to take this object over into the paint room to start texturing. In order to send the object over to the paint room, we need a UV generated, which is what we've already done. And what we'll do now is we'll go over to our bake option, and we'll go down to this option here called Retopo Model to per pixel painting without baking. Normally when we bake, we will bake from a high poly to a low poly object, and this would be the option that we would choose for that process. However, we just want to send this object over to the paint room without actually baking any of the information. So I'll go ahead and I'll click on this option. 3DCoat then asks me, what do I want to do with this object? It gives me the option of increasing the texture size, which I'll set to 4K, and then it'll give me these options here. Now, I don't need to change anything on this window, so I'm just going to hit, because we aren't essentially baking anything, this process is fairly fast. So already it's done. Let's hop over to the paint room now by clicking on this tab here. And you'll see our model is now in the paint workspace, and this now becomes a little bit like Photoshop in a way, because now my layers are here, and if you don't have this arrangement obviously as I've got it, you can go over to layers by choosing Windows, Panels, and moving down here to where it says Layers. And you can arrange these windows however you like. So here, for example, I'm just going to click on and make a new layer by hitting this plus icon, which will give me layer 2. I'll select a color from here. I have a brush selected. I'm going to turn off the normal map and the glossiness, channels, and just have this green dot selected here for color. And now I can go in and start to paint on my object. Again, I'm not going to go into much detail about the paint room, and we can create another series of tutorials. However, I will show some of the process into making our final asset. So here I have loaded in a finished model with all my textures. At the moment the layers are all turned off, but you can see here that my model has been brought over in the same way that we did previously. And you can see we have our UV down here under the texture editor tab. If you need to find the texture editor, you can go to textures and choose texture UV editor here. So if you remember, we previously clicked on this option here to give us a new layer, and we created some and we painted some green paint on our model. You can also create, by using this icon here, a folder. And that's how I like to arrange my layers here, by organizing them in folders. So if I choose this main mid section here and I spin this one down, you can see under this header of main mid, I have a bunch of layers that I've created. So if I turn this one on, you can see in the texture editor down here the area that I've painted and on the model. So let me show you how this was created, and then we'll turn the other layers on. So here we can see I built up a base layer which I called Steel Main Metal, and those were created using the Smart Materials tab, which I have located down here. But ones that come with 3DCoat come under the metal category here. So here I've used this steel smart material and I've placed it on this layer based on the UV area. So all I did for this was I selected my steel smart material, I used the fill option on here, and then with a new layer selected and calling that layer Steel Main Menu, I then just click into this area. So let's do that. I'll just close this down temporarily and turn it off. And I'll create a new layer again, like we did with the green paint, only this time I've got a smart material selected. And with my fill tool, I'm going to use this tool options here and say fill with color. You can see that's highlighted. And I'm going to click inside my UV texture editor here. Now it's not quite right at the moment. So let's undo that. I need to have my channels selected here. So if you notice that they're turned off. So let's enable all three channels, which is the normal, the color, and the glossy. Also, when I clicked on my steel smart material here, you can see I've got this control panel. And if I click on this little magnifying glass here, it's got a pattern in there. What I'm essentially doing here is scaling this pattern. And as I bring it right the way over, you can see that my pattern starts to show the properties of this smart material. Now don't worry if you don't understand this section. As I said, we're going to do another series of tutorials which cover this in more detail. So with this selected now, I've scaled and positioned my material to the right scale that I want it. And all I'm going to do now is just click on this UV island. And now you can see I'm getting some reflective properties with scratches on and a surface that's representing this steel. And I'm on this specific layer that I've created called layer 62. I'm keeping this within the boundaries of my UV area that I'm selecting. This way I have a lot of control over how this can look. For example, here we can see some normal map detail on this texture that I don't actually like. It's too deep. So with this layer selected, I can come over to the depth opacity and maybe reduce that down to say 20%. And you'll see that that now reduces. I can do the same with the glossy and also the metallic opacity as well of this specific layer. Okay, let's delete this now and turn on my main mid layer, and you can see all of the layers that I've used here to create this texture. Let's turn on the others now to see the final texture generated. So here I have a folder called nozzle, and I'll turn that one on, and you can see that texture there. Let's remove this. So you can see that nozzle layered there. So let's spin that one down. We can see all those layers that we used to generate that texture, the handle, the end cap, the main top area here to complete. And you'll also notice that we've got some curvature and ambient occlusion maps as well. Smart materials rely on these ambient occlusion and curvature map. And should you pick one of these that requires them, 3DCoat will go ahead and bake these so that these smart materials can appear correctly on your model. So let's just add the final trigger, and also we'll add our curvature, which I've used as a layer on its own just to give an extra little bit of wear and tear on the edges of our model. So that concludes our basic modeling tutorial for 3DCoat. And we've gone ahead and used the modeling tools inside our modeling room to generate this model from this concept. We've taken the results of that model over into the paint room, and we've ended up with this final asset. So I hope you've enjoyed this basic modeling introduction, and in the next tutorials we'll be going into more medium to advanced modeling techniques. See you next time.